just briefly recounting the dream was you.
Oh, okay. I'll recount that because it actually it wasn't intentional, but it actually feeds directly into that body of work.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And into everything we're talking about, actually. But yeah, the dream was that I was in college and expected to be more academic than I had been, because if you're in college, you're supposed to do that.
Yeah.
And the classes I was taking were, like chordate biology, or they were kind of science-oriented things, and you were supposed to have footnotes and all that. And I guess it was producing some stress in me because I just didn't have that in me.
Or memorizing just a huge body of facts that go along with understanding.
Right. I found everything interesting, but the discipline of being academic was, beyond. So I was reading Carl Jung, and I was trying to keep up with all this science stuff. And I had this, I think it was a dream, but it might have been a waking I don't know, vision or something.
Yeah, when you get into these hypnagogic states when you're sort of in between sleeping and
yeah, I don't remember what it was, but I remember it. It was I'm searching through the catacombs of these ancient cathedrals in Paris. And you know how in a dream, you know where you are, even though there's no signs or anything, you know you're there.
Had you been to Paris?
Yes.
So these might have been catacombs that you remembered well.
No one brought me to the catacombs. And on our team tour, no. And I was exhausted, and I went up to the main level of this great cathedral. No one else is there. And I walked towards the outdoors, and I had to push open these great doors, maybe 14 feet high, And I come out into the night, and there's a procession coming down the boulevard, and I realize it's being led by Carl Jung, the psychologist. And I immediately, without even thinking about it, I just telepathically sent my question, which I didn't know what my question was. I sent this question to him, and he stops and he looks up and points up in the sky, and there I see a circular image, kind of like that on the wall, like these worlds images.
Yes.
With, it's not, to my knowledge, it's not really important what it was of, although it was of a frog, like perfectly symmetrical, like looking straight down on it, or up at it, whatever. And my quest was resolved. Like looking at a picture, I felt like, well, I found my destination. And it wasn't about figuring anything out. It was about taking something in, just experiencing something without any kind of intellectual part of it at all.
I know, that's your dream you talk about, right?
Right. So that, strangely enough, that leads into this body of work, right? The world's images.
Yes.
Which didn't happen, for 30 years.
Yeah. But this was a photograph of the frog. This was a picture. Were you conscious that this was not an actual? This wasn't a world.
Well, I grew up with photography. I was very used to it. It wasn't like I discovered photography in that moment, because photography, that's another issue with me, that I never discovered photography, because I just was born into it. That's why I like to like sabotage it and explore its limits in my way. I mean, all kinds of people are doing that, but I like to say, well, I'm not just going to settle on using a photograph, plain, straight photograph. For this, I need to do something different. And the world's was different because it's...
Thank you.
It's using the full frame of that fisheye lens that made it a circle. It wasn't that I cut it out to be a circle. It was the lens. Every lens makes a circle.
Yeah.
It's just that most of the time, the circle is bigger than the film or the sensor, so you get a rectangular image, which I like. But that was my way of sort of taking a look at photography from a different perspective, I think.
Had you used that kind of lens before, the circular lens? This was
No, but I had done pictures that included the circular projection of a lens, not a fisheye lens, but with a big camera, you can put any lens on it you want. It fits mechanically into this box, you know. It doesn't have to be designed for that camera. So I did do these, that Going Back series, which was where I regressed to my birth or my gestational. So it was. I did use that before.
One of the funny things I think about, one of the characteristic things about that lens and those photographs is that it always seems like there's an atmosphere around the edge of the world. It frequently feels like there is this ozone layer almost enveloping the image. Does that happen with fisheye lens, or is it something that you were able to make?
I'd have to double check, but what that is I think it's the edge of the glass of that lens that creates that little bit of a boundary around it. But depending on how you process the image, you might lose it. And in the beginning, when I was doing these, I wasn't that focused on that. And then at some point, I said, well, wait a second. I really like seeing that for exactly the reason you're saying.
It is reminiscent of the shots that you see taken from spacecraft of Earth, which, I mean, I was born in 1970, but people who were born before I was will frequently talk about that as a moment that changed our perspective, the way that we see not just our world, but the way that we look at flat surfaces. But the way it changed landscape forever. You know, like now we're looking at. We have to understand the landscape is always part of a ball. Like we've always got the ball in our mind, the circle in our mind. Yeah.
And the rectangle kind of is an attempt to hang on to that flat linear thing.
Yes.
And this kind of accentuates the
curves.
The curve
that are always there.
Right. Yeah.
Which makes me think about the Thomas Pynchon's understanding of feng shui, which is like you don't draw right lines on the surface of the dragon. He's talking about Mason and Dixon.
Did you know that? You don't draw a straight line in front of a dragon.
And the surface, well, the dragon is the earth, right? Like so, you don't draw. So he's saying that the Mason-Dixon are surveyors, and they're making the Mason and Dixon line, and there's this primitive violence of this, trying to draw a straight line across the earth. Or the earth, like don't you don't draw a straight line across the earth.
It can't happen.
He doesn't accommodate that. There's violence in that. Like,
right, you'd have to cut through the earth, or you'd have to go above the earth in part of it. Yeah. And the Mason-Dixon line was the line between the North and the South. That's how they describe the Civil War. You know, I don't know if that's really true.
Well, the reason why it wasn't true is because Maryland, which is south of the Mason-Dixon line, was
part of the North.
It was part of the North. It was part of the North by armies. They brought the army in basically to make sure, because otherwise Washington D.C. would have been surrounded. So Maryland was not given unlike other states. It was right off the bat. It wasn't going to secede from the Union. They brought the army in because otherwise D.C. would have been isolated. But
so
if
that
you
was
yeah.
an act of war.
Yeah,
They-
in a way, it
they
was an
sort of
act of
took
war
over
because
Maryland.
there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Maryland, just like there were a lot of Union sympathizers in like North Carolina and northern Georgia. But they went along with the South because the rest of the state was would have isolated those states. So like anyway, that was the Mason thing.
All right.
Silly
yeah.
history.
Yeah. Well, somehow that may have something to do with what I'm doing, but I'm not aware.
No, but I do think that there's a idea of you've done a lot of photographs which are landscapes, rectangular landscapes, and moving from a rectangle to a circle has significance. It has the significance of, I think.
Well, it does have something to do with how you think versus how I think, which we were talking about, where you like to have lists and information and data.
Yeah.
I actually like forgetting. And this is maybe a little too generalized, but that's why I'm kind of drawn towards art from the Eastern Hemisphere. You know.
Yeah.
Because they do have these non-verbal traditions, whereas we make stories about God, and our Bible is full of all these stories. I never could get into it, really. I didn't understand how these stories related to my spiritual self. But like the stillness and emptiness of the East, you know, that kind of appealed more to me. And their non-narrative, of course they have beautiful landscapes, and, you know, it's hard to make a landscape that doesn't tell a story.
Yeah,
but
it is.
That's kind of what I'm
especially
trying
to me, you know.
Yeah, right.
I'm always.
Right.
I mean, I've always been guilty of imposing stories. I mean, I always see stories everywhere, and it's hard for me to turn that off. It's always been a way of understanding things. But I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think it's true that